This is the full-length presentation of a talk that I gave that was much more restricted in time via Skype to an organization of PEMF enthusiasts, but I'm going to post this version on YouTube for people who want to have live links and to other information, as well as who want to have the full explanation of each of the slides that I presented. Hi, I'm Bob Dennis, and this is an extended version of a talk that I recently gave in June of 2018 to discuss one of my blogs and its contents, the 12 things you need to know about PEMF. This content is based upon the blog that's posted on my website at the link shown, and it also contains some material from a different one of my companies. Conflict of interest statement is that I've invented and currently market some of these medical devices and others that are discussed in this talk. The first thing I think everybody needs to know about PEMF is that it really seems to work. It works for a lot of people for a lot of things, and you don't need to know this, but nobody's more surprised by that than me. I mean, I began as a skeptic researching PEMF for NASA in 1996 and 1997. I worked for them for a couple years as a consultant. But despite my greatest efforts to try to debunk PEMF, the experiments at NASA Johnson Space Center were very clear, and they showed repeatedly that gene expression was modulated not just by individual genes, but by whole functional families, like families of genes that relate to cellular growth and production of extracellular matrix. And there was really no denying it. We repeated those experiments multiple times and got the same results over and over. We, continue to research it, and I've continued to do research on it, and really, in modern times, there are over 1,000 published peer-reviewed scientific papers on PEMF and the benefits that they confer, in all kinds of different disease conditions. The interesting thing about PEMF is that it doesn't seem to mask symptoms. PEMF seems to address the underlying causes of many afflictions. So it's not just a pain blocker or a symptom alleviator. And this starts way back. There's been three pretty good books published on this that I think are more scientific and less of a sort of a sales pitch. The first one was by Pollock and Jerebeck, and that was published in the late 1990s, and that reviewed a lot of the literature that was developed on PEMF independently in the old Soviet Union, in basically Eastern Bloc countries. It was not, a lot of it's not even been translated into English, but this book, Magnetic Therapy, published in the late 90s, does an excellent job of covering both the theory and a lot of the experiments and the results that were done in a completely isolated area away from Western science. At the same time, there were scientists like Arthur Pila doing research in the mid-1970s, really starting to look at PEMF and the effects on cells and culture and other systems. And that's, summarized in the CRC handbook that I show in the middle on this slide, where both Dr. Pollock and Dr. Pila have chapters where they talk about the details of electromagnetic effects on cells, specifically PEMF. And then most recently, in late 2017, Dr. Pollock published an excellent book that I highly recommend called Power Tools for Health, in which he reviews, basically the most recent findings, pretty much the last 2 decades worth of findings on the clinical benefits of PEMF in a book titled Power Tools for Health. I started bookmarking it, but then I noticed that I sort of bookmarked every page, so I consider the entire book, as far as for me, is it's a thoroughly good read. There's areas where, Dr. Pollock's a personal friend of mine, so there's areas where he and I don't agree, but he's a clinician and I'm more of a biophysicist engineer, and I've been wrong a lot, so it's probably true that where Dr. Pollock and I disagree, he's probably correct. But nonetheless, I mean, we talk about this all the time, and he sent me a copy of his book and signed it when it first came out a few months ago. So I just highly recommend it. I think, you can't open it up to any page and not learn something about PEMF that's valuable, and it's affordable. So it's really hard after all of that, all the clinical experience, all of the large number now, up into the thousands of public of published peer-reviewed papers, it's really difficult to say that PEMF is just sort of fringe quack science and doesn't work. That would be, I think for scientists to say that would be scientific misconduct. Actually, they're just simply saying something that has no basis whatsoever in anything that could be considered a consensus opinion among scientists who've really studied PEMF. Moving on to the next topic, number 2, good PEMF research is hard to find. As a scientist, this is something that we talk about science in general, because some fields have confusion and a lot of controversy. Others, there's a pretty broad consensus. But PEMF has a disproportionately large amount of confusion, even among people who are trying to study it scientifically. And it turns out that good PEMF research is a little bit difficult to find, and there's a lot of confusion. And so I think the 7 top reasons for that, I list them below. Number 1, many scientific papers do not report the exact PEMF type that they used. So they may say 10 hertz at so many Gauss, but they don't talk about the exact waveform shape. They may just say, it's square wave, which of course every engineer knows. There's no such thing as a square wave. You can approximate it, but it's not exactly right. And the devil's in the details on PEMF. You really have to define the waveform. You can't just sort of say it's something. And oftentimes they don't even measure what it is. So they'll get the frequency not quite right or the amplitude not right. And so they're studying something, and they give these probably reliable clinical or biological results, but they don't describe the PEMF intervention that they use. So it's really hard to say that they're really contributing to our understanding of PEMF. Number 2, PEMF is not just one thing. There are many different forms, and they're not well documented. I'll discuss that later. Number 3, some forms of PEMF that have been studied may simply not work, while others work well. And if you don't really define what you're studying, you can't really tell the difference between the two. And unfortunately, science is done by people. So some scientific studies are poorly designed or executed. And a lot of scientific studies that are done carefully are not published because of something called publication bias. So it's a lot easier to publish something when you get a positive result, say, hey, look, I made something work. If you get a negative result, you can say, hey, I really carefully studied PEMF and it just doesn't work. Turns out, scientifically, it's about 4 to 6 times harder to publish a negative result than a positive result. And so as a result, in the scientific literature, we tend to see a positive outcomes, 5 times more frequently than we see negative outcomes, where we sort of say, well, we tried something carefully and it doesn't work. And so people don't get the benefit of seeing what didn't work, and so a lot of people end up redoing the same faulty experiments without knowing that other people have done them, and that's a great weakness in science that we need to fix. Some studies are highly biased. Now that's different than publication bias. Here we're talking about like personal, financial, professional bias. A lot of people do PEMF research, as I did when they started, trying to prove that it was wrong, that it didn't work. Other people are trying to prove that it works. And in science, you really shouldn't be trying to prove something. You should be trying to find the truth. And fortunately for me, it took a few smacks in the face with like irrefutable data, but I had to eventually admit, whoa, hold on a second, there really is something to this, even though I didn't believe it at first. At first, I was just like everybody else, practically in science, thinking, PEMF is just nonsense. I didn't see a way for magnetism to be transduced in eukaryotic cells generally, certainly not in human cells, and so I thought, well, there's no way for us to detect it at a cellular level, so there can't be anything there. Well, I was wrong, right? But that's the beauty of science. If you use the tool correctly, it will change your opinion when you're not right. And, you'll slowly, after you've exhausted every other possible option, you'll eventually come to the truth, right? So this personal, professional, financial bias is a problem in PEMF. Much of the disagreement in PEMF research is among non-scientists. So you get, basically marketers arguing with amateur debunkers, and neither one of them are very scientific, and so you get a lot of fake news. Okay, so I would estimate probably 95 to 99% of what you can read about PEMF on the internet is probably not reliable. It's probably sort of falls into broad categorization of fake news. It's, blind men leading each other into a ditch because people are arguing incorrectly on both sides of the PEMF argument. Not to say that you have to be a scientist to think about this intelligently. There's a lot of really smart clinical people who aren't scientists. There's a lot of really smart, just general people who take the time to sift through things, and they can have something important to say. But a lot of times the argument is dominated by the loudest voice, not the most thoughtful input. We see that in news in general. Definitely true for PEMF. And number 7 is the most difficult one to talk about as a scientist. It is that most scientific research in medicine is unreliable. And we call this the replicability crisis. Can we replicate an experiment? And I'll talk about that in the next slide. The answer is basically most of the time no. So we need to talk a little bit about scientific replicability, and this is a crisis that's across all of medical research. It's not just PEMF. Replicability is the cornerstone of the scientific method. What it means is that if I run an experiment and I describe it carefully and I tell you what I did, what materials I used, what processes I used, the conditions of the experiment, somebody else, a different scientist somewhere else, should be able to take that description, replicate the experiment, and if we both did the experiment, without doing something systematically wrong, if we both basically did the experiment right, we should get about the same answer, right? It won't be exactly the same because there's variability and everything, but if you have an important finding, somebody else should be able to replicate it. Either way, either positive or negative finding, you should be able to say, well, okay, we replicated the experiment, we got a similar result. If you are unable to replicate an experiment, and many other scientists try and they're unable to replicate an experiment, that tells you that probably the original experiment was deeply flawed and its results are not to be trusted. So this is really, really important because the medical industry depends almost entirely upon initial groundbreaking research from universities. So they're always looking for what's the latest, greatest, biggest new earth-shattering idea that's coming out of academia. And there was a case recently where 2 different companies, Amgen and Bayer, you've probably heard of both of them, they independently ran studies of the scientific replicability of high-impact academic research in the case of cancer. So they were looking at, they were trying to replicate, and they put money into this. They basically said, okay, what are the most important findings in cancer in the last, 5 or 10 years? And so they collected a couple hundred papers, and they were looking for top peer-reviewed journals, top academic institutions, the best laboratories at the best places, top laboratories that were NIH funded, that had major long-term ongoing research programs that had been peer-reviewed and had passed, scientific muster. The papers had been published in scientific peer review, which is considered academically to be the gold standard of reliable science. And this work was done by top scholars, and then these companies said, hey, we will pay you money if you will just sit down and repeat the experiment for us and prove to us that you can make it happen again. And most of the scientists said, yeah, sure, I'll take the money, I'll do the experiment again. Sometimes they didn't, and sometimes they had to pay somebody else to try to replicate it, but under the best possible conditions, where you've got plenty of money, you've got the best people at the best places in the best labs who's already done the experiment, they've already published it, and you're asking them just to repeat it again. It turns out that Amgen, I think it was Amgen, found the replicability of only 11%. And then Bayer found it was only 25% replicable, which meant that you had 89% not repeatable science from under the best possible conditions with the best possible people in the best possible labs. Still 89% of this important cancer research was not repeatable. And then when Bayer ran their study, they found that it was about 75% not replicable. So we have this tremendous crisis in medical research where we're, the vast majority of the papers that we're publishing from academia fail the basic criterion of scientific replicability. And this is a major problem. Now, this is also true in PEMF, but just to let you know, this is where people are constantly attacking PEMF, saying, well, it's not as good as mainstream science. But mainstream science has really deep problems here. And this is a crisis where, if you talk honestly to scientists, they'll admit it. They'll tell you about it. But have you ever seen it in the newspaper? Probably not. So this is one of those things that you need to know about when you're sort of assessing, mainstream versus alternative science, is that mainstream science has this major problem. If something like 89%, that's almost 9 out of every 10 research papers are completely unrepeatable. They're really not reliable science. And the other problem is we don't know which 10% is reliable, right? It brings into question the entire body of scientific research in health and medicine for the last many decades. Is really, unless something has been replicated reliably, independently, you really can't. There's a 80 or 90% chance that it's just wrong.